In this video, I want to talk about how to implement God's new moon festivals and his 30-day calendar. So in a previous video, I discussed how to essentially reconcile God's 30-day month. He's already told us what his month consists of. From new moon to new moon, that's his month. He hasn't set his month in reference to the sun. He hasn't set his month in reference to a 60-second minute and a 60-minute hour and a 24-hour day. He hasn't done that. So when we're looking at what God has established, which is new moon to new moon, that's 1 month, and he defines that month has 30 days. Then we have to be able to reconcile this. So in Genesis 1, it says that that there was evening and there was morning, and that was 1 day. Evening and morning are 1 day. It's kind of a weird thing, right? I mean, you would think that he would say evening to just before the next evening, that's 1 day. Well, later on, when he's talking about the festivals, he goes on to tell you that from the evening of the 9th to the evening of the 10th, you are to observe the Day of Atonement and withhold from yourself. Okay, so the evening of the 9th actually turns into the 10th. And so now we're understanding that this is a day. But we can't disregard what God has said. Then there was evening and there was morning, and that was a day. And it's kind of peculiar. And as you go on to what I did today was that I calculated the timing of when the new moon comes up 1 month and when it comes up the next month. And indeed, what the world says, according to a 24-hour day, there are 29.5 days in God's month. But God says in his word that there's 30 days. So something's fishy, guys. You can't say, like science can't say there's 29.5 days in God's lunar month and then say, well, then but on the lunar calendar, there's 29 days and 30 days in a month. I mean, what's happening with the 0.5? Why is 1 month coming up short and 1 month has an extra 0.5 days? Well, because they chunked off from 1 month and gave it to the other. And so we're getting whole day months because that's what man decided was better than what God decided. Well, I say that what God decided is better. Even if it's inconvenient, it's the better way. And that's what we're going to pursue. So in that other video where I discussed this, that video, by the way, is entitled God's 30-day month, or God's 30-day lunar month, rather. I demonstrate to you that there are some new moons that come up at night. There are some new moons that come up in the morning, and there are some that come up in the afternoon, during the day. And that can get a little weird and a little confusing because on a new moon that comes up in the morning, like let's say 9:30 a.m., what we've been calling 9:30 a.m., if the new moon comes up at that time, you're going to hear the rooster crow probably around 7:30, about 2 hours before it comes up. That's going to tell you, hey, the new moon is coming. You're going to have your new moon celebration, and then that evening is going to begin another day. So now you've gone through 3 dates in what we are calling 1 day. That's weird, but it's what he established. Okay, well, we have to test it, right? So if you have between new moon and new moon, you have what God is saying, okay, evening until morning, a day. Now you have in the morning a new moon that's showing up. And so now you got to figure out, well, what are you going to do with that? How do you reconcile that? And then you have another evening to morning, and that's another day. And this occurs on the months that science is telling you are only 29 days. So essentially what you're doing, or what God is doing, is he's adding back in his half a day. And he's saying, no, this is how I established it. And that 29.5 days is defined as 3 days. So you have evening to morning, a day. You have a new moon that shows up at 9:30 a.m. That means that's your new day. That's your new month. And so you're going to observe that day until evening when the new day starts. I know it's weird, guys, but you got to take a look. I mean, I've calculated from when the new moon comes up for an entire year. There is 29.5 something, 3 days between new moon and new moon. And the only way that you can reconcile this is by looking at the new moon and saying, okay, this is when the month begins. This is when the first day of God's month begins. And he's told us that the next day is going to begin in the evening. Now, you know that if I'm going to present something to you that I have to test it. And so I took to the word. Well, I first had a conversation with God that went something like this. This is really weird. So if I'm going to present this, I have to make sure that it's true. So I'm going to need you to prove to me that this is true and show me in your word. All right. So, and we know that God's new moon is resetting everything. So we had 4 consecutive weeks of Sabbaths, and then we had the 30th day, which now we realize the 30th day can it can run into or run up against rather the new moon, and it can be cut short too by that new moon coming up. All right. Well, let's take a look at scripture. So what I did was I looked up new moon day. I wanted to see what did God say? Is there any context in which he's talking about new moon day as like a full day, like from evening to evening? So here in Psalm 81:3, it says, sound the ram's horn at the new moon, and when the moon is full on the day of our festival. So what I want to point out to you first is that repeatedly he's just referring to it as the new moon and the festival of the new moon, but he doesn't ever refer to it as like a full day. Ezekiel 46:1, this is what the sovereign Lord says, the gate of the inner court facing east is to be shut on the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath day and on the day of the new moon, it is to be open. Okay, so he doesn't refer to it as new moon day, but he refers to Sabbath day and he refers to working days, but he doesn't refer to new moon day. He refers to it as the day of the new moon. And I believe that that's significant because you could have a new moon that is only existing from morning until just before evening. Again, he does the same thing in verse 6 of in verse 6, on the day of the new moon, he is to offer a young bull, 6 lambs, and a ram, all without defect. Then Hosea 2:11, similar to Lamentations 2:6, tells us that he's going to stop all of our celebrations, our yearly festivals, our new moons, our Sabbath days, and all of our appointed festivals. I've seen this so many times in the Word, and it's never occurred to me, I guess because we thought we were celebrating correctly, never occurred to me that he was talking about us. But he has done it. He has stopped all of our celebrations. He has totally allowed us to be handed over to what we chose, to what our ancestors chose, to what we defiled because we didn't love truth. And you remember that he says, your new moon festivals, I hate with all my being. They're detestable to me because of the way that people were celebrating these things to themselves. I wonder how he feels about Easter and Christmas, celebrating pagan holidays to him as though we're somehow worshiping him. So he's removed these from us and he's restoring them now. And you know what, guys? I hope you don't take that for granted because it is a big deal that we're living during a time that he's giving these things back to us, that he's giving these gifts back to us, including the calendar. And so don't treat it like it's an inconvenience. Don't treat it like, we have to do this. It's a burden to you. Don't treat it like that. This is a huge deal that we're even living during this time because our ancestors didn't have this opportunity to be priests of God, to celebrate his true Sabbaths and new moons and appointed times. This is a blessing. This is a gift. And I'll tell you something else is that God has really poured into me. Last night, I was toiling over this and trying to understand, and I could feel him. The day before, I felt him. He completely poured into me understanding and wisdom. But last night, as we were preparing for this month's Sabbath, listen, I'm not saying that Sunday is Sabbath. I'm talking about this month's Sabbath because the Sabbath actually changes every month on God's calendar. So last night, as I was entering in and I was toiling over this, he would not give me understanding. And he actually started making my eyes hurt and all kinds of stuff because he was letting me know I had to enter his rest. So there's something really powerful about that. And that's confirmation that we are indeed observing his correct Sabbath because he would not let me do anything. And I felt him being strict with me today, making sure that I wasn't taking his Sabbath lightly. So I'm going to tell you something. With knowledge comes responsibility, doesn't it? If you haven't been observing God's Sabbaths correctly, if you've been lackadaisical or justifying certain things, I want to tell you something. You now have the responsibility, if you've been bestowed wisdom, to tighten it up. You must obey. And in fact, God's Sabbaths are so important. He says that you will die for not observing his Sabbaths. His Day of Atonement, you will die if you don't observe his Day of Atonement. Am I trying to scare you? I mean, not really. I'm trying to stir up fear of God, not of me, because it's important. It's important that we're doing this. Colossians 2:16, therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. He could have just as easily said a new moon day or a Sabbath day. And look, we are still counting new moon as a day, but I think that, it seems to me that what God is doing in not calling it a new moon day, because it's really more like half a day or a transition some of the time, like if the new moon came up at night, then you would have, you have that evening and then the morning and so until the next evening. But in certain cases, you have a new moon that is not a full number of hours. But God never defined his day in terms of hours. And so if indeed a day, would be, so he's defined those days to be evening to morning, then at some point when new moon comes around and it starts in the morning, you're going to have new moon. In order to stay on track with his moon calendar, it's going to have to be that you are observing the new moon day, that transitional restarting new moon day from morning until that evening. It just has to be. And if you look at the timestamps of when these are occurring, then you will see that very clearly. There's no way to take what we're calling a day, a 24-hour period. There's no way to take that and call it a day and keep in line with the witness in the sky. The witness in the sky is going to tell you everything. Now listen again to the way that he refers to new moon. 2 Chronicles 2:4. Now I'm about to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, to dedicate it to him, and for burning fragrant incense before him, for setting out the consecrated bread regularly, and for making burnt offerings every morning and evening, and on the Sabbaths, at the new moons, and at the appointed festivals of the Lord our God. This is a lasting ordinance for Israel. So again, he says, for making burnt offerings every morning and evening, and on the Sabbaths, at the new moons, and at the appointed festivals of the Lord our God, at the new moons. So again, it's got to be like the new moon shows up, and that's when you're observing the new moon celebration. Man can change things all day, right? The Antichrist, the Catholic Church, the counterfeit Christianity, people on YouTube, we can change things all day by our own understanding. We can change things, by our own rules and our own interpretations, but we can't change the moon, guys. New moon is new moon. And if you're looking from one new moon to another, this is what it is. There can't be any other explanation. And if you think there is, then let me know. Present it. Based on scripture, present it. Again, in 2 Chronicles 31:3, you see that it's still being referred to as new moons. There's no real reference to new moon day. It's more of day of the new moon. There's not even really a reference to the evening of the new moon. I looked that up as well. Because the new moon is always going to be during the day, but it's not always going to be the first day of the new moon. It's not always going to be in the evening, but it will always be in the day. Because if it comes up in the evening, then it's going to go from evening until morning, and you're going to have, and until the following evening. But like I said, if it comes up in the morning, then you won't have an evening of that first day of the new moon. I know this is weird because my head was like exploding when he first showed me this, and I sat on it because I didn't want to post it right away. I wanted to make sure that this was correct. I needed to first test it with scripture. Let's also look at Genesis 1, verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So you can have a day in which you have evening and morning, and you can also have the day of the new moon, which just so happens on God's calendar to be counted as day one. I know it's weird, but it checks out if you do the calculations. So if you listen to that video that I posted earlier, the God's 30-day lunar month, I know your brain's going to explode. Don't do it at night. Or do it. Who cares? God's going to lead you through it. He's either going to testify to it or not. That's the most important thing. So ask him, pray, ask him, is this true? Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter if it's an inconvenience to you. The only thing that matters is whether it's true or not. So please go discern this with God.